When Annie came to Boston College 4 years ago, she never imagined falling in love with art and becoming an art history major. Summer seminar in Rome ignited Annie's passion for Baroque art, and she pushed her to study the work of Bernini and his students as part of an advanced study agreement. In addition to studying the art of the Baroque period, Annie has also studied the history of early modern period through the church history minor. Her senior seminar paper discussed the work of Giovanni Battista Gali, a student of Bernini, and the artistic theories and practices he employed to create his masterpieces in the Church of Gesu in Rome. In addition to studying art and drinking too much coffee in the basement of Babs, Annie is involved in the Liturgy Arts Group and Cura, the works at the MFA as a student ambassador.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. So today I will be talking about two artists who worked together to create one fresco that I believe revolutionized Baroque art and really changed the way I view the world. So I don't know how many of you know that much about Baroque art, but whenever I tell people I study Baroque art, I get some interesting reactions and some interesting descriptions of what they think Baroque art is. Some of my favorites include gaudy, over the top, too dramatic, tacky, and my personal favorite, an appallingly awful piece of crap. So it suffices to say Baroque art is not the favorite of the art historical periods, but it's one that I've really come to love, and so I'm hoping by the time I leave today, you all will have a greater appreciation of Baroque art. So my story with Baroque art really begins with my summer seminar in Rome. I was a sophomore in college, and when I found out that there was this church history class, I knew I had to take it because it was the amazing opportunity to combine all of my studies, my love of art, church history, and gelato. So I went to Rome, and I immediately fell in love with this city. And I was just overwhelmed by all of the amazing art and architecture there, the way that history was intertwined on the streets. But one artist continually caught my eye, and his name was Gian Lorenzo Bernini. For those who don't know, Bernini was one of the leading Baroque artists of his day. He worked underneath every single pope that reigned in the Baroque period at the time, and he really transformed the city of Rome through his architecture, his sculpture, and his monuments that he put up all over the city. Some of my favorite works by Bernini include the Apollo and Daphne, which is one of his earliest sculptures, in which he really takes marble and brings it to life in a way that no other sculptor had before. When you see these leaves above Daphne's hands up close and personal, it still looks like they're fluttering in the wind. Some other works he did include the elephant and obelisk that is currently outside the Pantheon, and to be honest, I just think this one's really cute because I love elephants. Another really important work by him is the Four Rivers Fountain in Piazza Navona, where artists still gather today to try and sell their paintings. And this is just one of the most incredible works of technical innovation and functionality. I can't go into that now because we don't have all night, unfortunately. But suffice it to say that Bernini really changed the way that the city looked and felt with his different pieces of art. And finally, one of his other most important pieces is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa in the Cornaro Chapel. Some of you may recognize this from Dan Brown's Angels and Demons novel or the movie. It plays a pretty important role in Robert Langdon's hunt across Rome. But for Bernini, it was really a chance for him to combine sculpture, architecture, and fresco. And these are going to become very important in just a moment, and you'll see why soon. So that's the first artist I met in Rome, was Bernini, and I was just overwhelmed by the incredible things he was able to do with sculpture. But the second artist I met a different way. One day I was walking down the street, and we walked by this church, my classmates and I, and something clicked in my brain, and I was like, I've seen this church before. We talked about it in one of my art history classes. I couldn't quite remember the name at the time, but I just knew that there was something really cool inside that church and that I had to go into it. So I walked into the church. I learned that it was the Gesu, the mother church of the Jesuits, so very important for us BC students. It's actually where St. Ignatius is buried, in case you're ever in Rome. But I walked into this church, and this fresco stopped me in my tracks. This is the Triumph of the Name of Jesus. And what's happening in this fresco is that this center sort of sun-like disc right here is actually the name of Jesus, IHS. And all of these saints and angels and church history figures are praising his name up in the heavens, floating on some clouds, while the damned are being cast down into hell. So it's a pretty dramatic subject. I would say that that is one of the more accurate descriptions of Baroque art. And it's one that really knocks me off my feet. But what really knocked me off my feet was that when I first walked in, I couldn't tell the difference between what was ceiling, what was fresco, what was sky. I was just blown away because it was so realistic. And to just give you some extra context, this is how the fresco looks from the ground. It's a little hard to see in slides, unfortunately. That's part of the struggles of studying Baroque art. But you can see how these figures even float right above the windows there and really just make it look as though this fresco has come to life in the church. And so I immediately fell in love with this fresco. I knew I had to study it more. I knew I had to learn more about it. So I decided to devote sort of the rest of my studies to it at BC, and it became the subject of my senior seminar paper. And I learned that the artist was a man named Giovanni Battista Gali. Gali was an artist who studied under Bernini and became one of his best friends, actually. Bernini became one of his son's godfathers, and so they had a really close connection. And so I learned that even in the Gesu, Bernini had a hand. He had some influence over this artist. And so I was really interested in that, and I was really interested in learning what made this fresco so special and why it was just so intense and why it came to life for me. So I got that study grant that Jack mentioned, and I flew back to Rome the next summer to study everything I could get my hands on about Gali and Bernini. And throughout my time there, I learned that Gali had a tendency to take whatever Bernini carved in sculpture and apply it to fresco. He made these incredibly lifelike frescoes because he was able to use Bernini's sculptural techniques in his paintings. And that's what's happening in this fresco here. One of the most important parts of this fresco, I would say, is actually the drapery, because it becomes so active and so alive, and the shadows just moving in and out of these figures here just really makes it seem like you are staring up at these figures in space. So I discovered this amazing aspect of Gali's work, but I still didn't quite know how to turn that into a giant 50-page paper. So I came back to school a little disheartened and a little concerned, and suddenly my art history professor was making us read dozens and dozens of books on art history theory and other random theories that I didn't know much about. And we were learning all of these things, and one weekend I sat down on my couch and read an entire book on Ferdinand Saussure. Ferdinand Saussure is a linguistic theorist whose linguistic theory has come to be known as structuralism. And after finishing this book that weekend, I sat down and I looked at all my research, and I was like, you know what? This is the key to unlocking my fresco. Not my fresco, obviously, but I'd come to feel that way after a while. This is the key to understanding why Bernini's art is so great. And so I went about, and so if you'll digress with me for a moment, I'm going to attempt to explain structuralism, and we'll do the best we can. So structuralism is an arbitrary system, and that's really how our language works. All language is really arbitrary, and it's based upon a set of signs that we've designed and have denoted to represent things. So, for example, this object right here, we all call it a tree. But if we were suddenly in this room to decide that we wanted to call a tree something else, like a floor bat, I don't know, any word, it doesn't matter. Say we were to call this a floor bat, suddenly, as long as we all agreed that this object right here was that new word, then the language would still work. Everything would still exist, because language is a social contract. So together, we all decide how to communicate with one another. And along with being arbitrary and a social contract, language is a system of relationality that works upon a set of differences. So what does this mean? What this means is that every definition we have, every word we use, only makes sense in contrast to all the other words around it. And this works because even though nature in its natural form is a continuum, it's there's no really division among the things of nature, it doesn't happen until we add categories to it. So we make sense of our world by dividing it into categories. And size is a great example of this. So here we have this tree, it's just chilling there, it's a tree. But suddenly when I put a smaller tree next to it, there's a system here, because this tree is now bigger than that tree. And when I add an even bigger tree, suddenly we have a small, medium, and large tree. So what we've just done is categorize all of these different trees. And we can categorize them further. You know, we have oak trees, we have maple trees, we have evergreen trees. So there's all of these different types of trees going on. And there's a few other terms that Saussure uses to help make sense of this system of relationality. So I'm just going to go through those a little bit quickly. One of them is the signifier and the signified. So the signifier is the word or sound that we make when we want to explain something. And the signified is the actual object itself. So here we have a grumpy cat, and here we have the word cat and that sound cat. And that when we say cat to one another, we know that we're talking about this animal right here. The next one is langue and parole. And langue is really just the system, the set of rules that we have that allows us to communicate with one another. So this includes grammar, you know, parts of speech, really anything that helps us communicate and helps us form sentences and paragraphs and novels. And then parole is the speech act. So that's when we actually open our mouths and decide to communicate to one another. The last one is value and signification. So this is a set of terms that really only means that things only make sense in context. So if you and I were sitting in this room and I said to you, I saw a grumpy cat today, you would think to yourself about this grumpy cat right here. Now imagine we're both sitting in the jungle and I say to you, I saw a grumpy cat today. This is probably the cat you're thinking I'm talking about. And the reason this works is because language makes sense in context. We have to have context in order to understand what we're saying to one another. So now the question is, how do we apply this to Baroque art? Well, I realized that Bernini's theories that he had about fresco painting and Baroque art in general were very similar to Saussure's paintings. Bernini had this theory called the bel composto, in which he combined what at the time in Baroque art were three distinct categories: architecture, painting, and sculpture. And he really put them all together to make what he called a total art, a bel composto. And within the bel composto, there were I contrapposti, or the contrasts. And that was the ways in which these three arts interacted in order to make each one stand out more prominently. So in Gali's fresco here, in which he used Bernini's design, we have sculpture among the angels that are holding up this frame, the gilding itself, so that's the architecture, and then the fresco within it. And together, all of these are combined to make this amazing piece of art. And the distinctions between the three of them heighten their differences and make them more believable for us. So one great example here is the shadows that these clouds form. These clouds are not real clouds, and yet they appear to form real shadows, which are actually glazed onto the gilding. So it makes them look as though they are actually popping out of the frame. It makes them more believable. And these figures here are interacting with the frame that they tumble out of, even though they are paintings and the frame is architecture. And it all works together to make this amazing piece of art. And you can see this piece of art at work in another of Bernini's works, the Cathedra Petri, which is in the Vatican in Rome. And you can see that he's doing the same thing. He's taking glass window sculpture and combining it with sculpture so that this painting looks as though it's acting upon this sculpture, and this sculpture is coming into the church. It's mingling with the architecture. And together these three things make this one total work of art. And so really, that's what's going on here, and that's how structuralism works. It's taking these differences that we have and seeing how we can combine them to make something that is beautiful and relatable. And this can be applied to other works of art too. So if we look at these brushstrokes, what are they? They're just brushstrokes. They're just blue paint on a white canvas. They don't make any sense because they don't have any context and they don't have any signification. But when we put them in their proper context, suddenly you have Van Gogh's Starry Night. And these brushstrokes right here that were formerly meaningless without their context become an important part of a system. They become signs for the sky as opposed to signs for a steeple or a hill or a star. And they've been given a place, a home, and it makes them beautiful. So the real question is, how can we take pieces of art like this and the lessons that we learn from these pieces of art and apply them to our lives? And I think that's really why this theory, this system, changed the way I view the world, because Bernini was able to take the context that he was living in, Rome, and he was able to look at everything that was going on around it, and he was able to say, you know what, there's different categories here, but I don't want those categories, so I'm going to change them. And that we really all have the potential to do that. The trick is just recognizing the categories that are in our lives and using them to make something better and to make something different. So that's my Baroque art spiel for you. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the rest of the talks.